Right now, as you're watching this, the United States is facing an energy war like never before. But here's the part no one is talking about. It's a war America might already be losing. Because in a shocking overnight move, China just pulled off a secret deal. One that could cripple America's oil industry for decades. And if Washington doesn't act fast, it might be too late to stop what's coming next. But this isn't just about oil. This is about power, control, global dominance. And as of today, China just made a move that could shift the balance forever. But the scariest part? The US never saw it coming. While American politicians argued China was planning, waiting. And now their plan is unfolding at full speed. So what's really happening here? And more importantly, what happens next? Well, the answer might shock you. Because what China just did behind closed doors could change everything. And by the time the US reacts, it might already be too late. Let's break it down. Right now, the global energy market is shifting at a speed no one expected. But here's the real question. Was this shift natural or was it orchestrated? Because what's happening isn't just a supply chain issue. It's a carefully calculated move, one that's been in the making for years. And if you trace the steps backward, the pattern becomes disturbingly clear. It all starts with a single event, the moment that triggered everything. On February 10, 2025, US President Donald Trump signed an executive order imposing a 25% tariff on all Canadian imports. On the surface, it was a political move, an effort to crack down on illegal immigration and drug trafficking. But what Washington failed to consider was the domino effect this decision would have. Because just across the border, Canadian officials were watching and they weren't happy. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau wasted no time responding. Standing before a packed press conference, he made one thing very clear. Canada wasn't going to sit back and take this without a fight. In a matter of hours, Canadian officials started drafting retaliatory measures. But here's where it gets interesting, because one of those measures was more than just a policy decision. It was a warning, a threat that could shake the foundation of the US economy. Canada's oil exports to the US make up a massive portion of America's energy supply. In fact, without Canadian crude, refineries in the Midwest and Rocky Mountain regions wouldn't even function. But now, Trudeau's government was considering cutting off those exports entirely. This wasn't just economic retaliation. This was leverage, because without Canadian crude, US gasoline prices could skyrocket overnight. Supply chains could crumble. The ripple effect would be felt across every American city. And just when the market started to panic, China saw its opportunity. Because while Washington was focused on Canada, China had been making moves behind the scenes. Deals, negotiations, strategic partnerships that would ensure one thing: China's energy security at any cost. For years, Beijing had been working quietly, securing new suppliers. They weren't just importing oil from their usual partners. They were diversifying, pulling in crude from countries the US had long ignored: Iran, Russia, Venezuela. Nations that, under heavy US sanctions, had been locked out of Western markets. Nations that needed buyers. And China? They were more than willing to take advantage of the situation. Because with every barrel of oil China purchased from sanctioned countries, they were doing two things. One, strengthening their alliances with politically isolated suppliers. Two, reducing their dependence on US oil. And this wasn't just a short-term strategy. This was long-term energy warfare. By the time the US realized what was happening, the numbers were already staggering. In just 1 year, China's oil imports from the US dropped by nearly 50%. What was once a dominant trade partnership had now collapsed. But that was only the beginning, because at the same time, China was securing something even bigger: a deal with Saudi Arabia. For decades, Saudi Arabia has been one of America's closest oil allies. But Beijing had been working behind closed doors, negotiating a move that would completely shift the balance of power in global energy markets. And then, on a quiet morning in March 2025, it happened. The Saudi government announced that for the first time in history, they would begin selling oil to China in yuan, not US dollars. This was catastrophic news for the US. For nearly a century, the global oil market had revolved around the petrodollar, the system that required all oil sales to be conducted in US currency. This wasn't just about money. This was about power, because as long as the world traded oil in dollars, the US maintained global financial dominance. But now, that dominance was slipping. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, China made its next move. They didn't just stop buying US oil, they started dumping US energy products entirely. In retaliation for US tariffs, Beijing imposed a 10% levy on American crude oil, and a 15% tariff on liquefied natural gas, LNG, and coal. The message was clear. China didn't need American energy anymore. And the moment that news hit, panic spread across Wall Street. US oil companies, once riding high on global exports, saw their stock prices plummet overnight. Energy analysts warned of an imminent crisis. And American policymakers? They scrambled for a solution. But it was already too late. Because behind closed doors, China had already lined up alternative suppliers. They turned to Russia, securing record-breaking oil imports at steeply discounted rates. They increased shipments from Iran, using secretive methods like deactivating transponders and mid-sea transfers to avoid detection. And they expanded deals with Venezuela, locking in cheap crude at prices US producers simply couldn't compete with. And here's the dangerous part. China wasn't just shifting its own oil supply. They were reshaping global energy markets entirely. Every time China reduced its US imports, it sent shockwaves through the industry. Other countries started following suit, pulling their investments from American energy markets and looking for cheaper, more politically stable options. And the result? For the first time in years, America's grip on global energy dominance was slipping. But the real question is, was this all just an accident? Or was it part of a much bigger plan? Because if you connect the dots, one thing becomes clear. This was never just about oil. It was about something much bigger. Something that could change the way the world trades forever. And that's when the US finally realized just how deep this crisis was about to go. But here's where things get even more dangerous. Because just as Washington prepared its next move, China made one last decision that would leave America completely cornered. And if you think what happened so far is bad, you haven't seen anything yet. The warning signs were there. The data was flashing red. But inside Washington, no one was paying attention until it was too late. Because by the time US officials realized what was happening, China had already made its final move. And that move? It sent shockwaves through the global economy. This wasn't just another trade dispute. This wasn't just another political standoff. This was the moment everything changed. For decades, the world had relied on one simple fact. America controlled the flow of global oil. The petrodollar system, the dominance of US energy exports, and the sheer size of American oil production kept the country at the top of the global order. But now, that system was falling apart, and it all started with a single decision from China's leadership. Behind closed doors, in a meeting that few in the West even knew was happening, Chinese officials had been negotiating something that would completely rewrite the rules of global trade, a new alliance, one that cut the United States out completely. This wasn't just about buying oil in yuan. This wasn't just about securing alternative suppliers. This was about building an entirely new economic system. A system where China, not the United States, would be at the center of global energy. And when that plan was finally revealed to the world, the fallout was immediate. Oil prices spiked overnight. Wall Street went into panic mode. And for the first time in years, Washington found itself completely outmaneuvered. Because what China had just done was bigger than anyone expected. They hadn't just secured deals with Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. They had brought in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and even parts of Europe into the new energy trade system. For the first time in modern history, the world had an alternative to the US-controlled oil market. And the US? They were on the outside looking in. The implications of this were catastrophic. Because overnight, the demand for US oil collapsed. Major energy exporters pulled their shipments from American suppliers, redirecting them toward the new China-led system. The result? The US economy started spiraling toward an energy crisis. Gasoline prices skyrocketed. Inflation surged. And for the first time in decades, the world's most powerful economy looked vulnerable. But this wasn't the worst part. Because deep inside, the Pentagon, a far more alarming realization was setting in. This wasn't just about oil, this was about war. For years, US military dominance had been built on energy control. The ability to cut off or restrict oil supply to adversaries was one of America's greatest strategic weapons. But now, that weapon was gone. China had just neutralized one of the most powerful tools in US foreign policy. And that meant something even worse. For the first time in modern history, America could no longer use energy as leverage. And that changed everything. But even as the crisis deepened, Washington refused to admit just how bad things were getting. Publicly, officials insisted that the situation was under control, that China's new system was not a real threat. But behind the scenes, they were scrambling for a response. Because the reality was stark. If the US didn't act fast, it could lose complete control of the global energy system. So Washington did what it always does in a crisis. It doubled down. The White House rushed out new sanctions, trying to block China's energy deals. The Treasury Department froze billions in Chinese assets, attempting to pressure Beijing into reversing its decisions. And the US military increased its presence in the South China Sea, sending a clear warning that if China's actions crossed a certain line, there would be consequences. But here's the thing. China had already accounted for this, because when the US sanctions hit, Beijing didn't back down. Instead, they accelerated their plans. In a shocking counter-move, China and Russia announced a massive new oil and gas pipeline deal, cutting the US out of yet another key market. At the same time, Beijing unveiled a new digital currency system designed to further undermine the petrodollar. And then came the final blow. China officially signed a military cooperation agreement with Saudi Arabia and Iran, a move that sent a clear message to Washington. The message was simple. The era of US dominance in the energy market was over. The US had a choice. It could escalate further, risking a full-scale conflict, or it could adapt to the new reality. But here's where things get even more dangerous. Because as Washington debated its next move, China made one last game-changing decision. A decision that pushed the US into a corner. A decision that left the White House with no good options. And if you thought what happened so far was bad, what comes next is even worse. For years, the world believed that China's energy policies were simply reactionary, a response to US tariffs, economic shifts, and market fluctuations. But what if that wasn't the case? What if everything we're seeing right now, the collapse of US energy dominance, the rise of China's new alliances, the unraveling of the petrodollar, wasn't just a series of coincidences? What if it was all part of a carefully crafted plan? Because when you look closely, one thing becomes clear. China didn't just adapt to these crises, they created them. And behind the scenes, Beijing had been playing a long game, one that the US never saw coming. It all started years ago. For decades, America controlled the global energy market. The world needed US oil, and every major energy deal was done in US dollars. This wasn't just about economics, it was about power. The petrodollar system meant that as long as oil was traded in dollars, America held the financial high ground over every other nation on earth. China saw this, and they saw the weakness in it, because America's energy dominance wasn't built on production alone. It was built on control. Control over who was allowed to sell oil. Control over which countries could access energy markets. Control over the financial systems that dictated global trade. And most importantly, control over who could challenge US supremacy. For China, this was a dangerous reality, because no matter how powerful Beijing became, as long as America controlled oil, they could cripple China's economy at any moment. All it would take was a single move, an embargo, a supply chain disruption, a financial sanction, and suddenly, China's economic rise could be shut down overnight. So Beijing did something that no one expected. They built a system that made US energy dominance obsolete. They didn't need to beat America at its own game. They just had to change the rules of the game entirely. And that's exactly what they did. First, they systematically reduced their dependence on US oil. It started small, quietly shifting imports away from American suppliers, increasing trade deals with alternative energy partners. But behind closed doors, something even bigger was happening. Beijing was forming a shadow energy alliance, one that cut the US out completely. They secured long-term deals with Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, three of the world's biggest oil producers outside of Washington's control. And to make sure these deals couldn't be disrupted by US sanctions, they bypassed the dollar completely. Instead of using the petrodollar system, they set up a new currency exchange, one that allowed countries to trade oil in Chinese yuan, Russian rubles, or even digital currencies outside of the traditional banking system. This wasn't just an economic shift, it was an act of financial warfare. Because the moment these deals went live, America's control over global energy started to crumble. But China wasn't done yet, because while they were securing alternative suppliers, they were also buying up resources that would ensure long-term dominance. They didn't just want to replace US oil, they wanted to control the future of energy itself. That's why China invested billions into renewable energy, making sure they could undermine America's oil exports even further. And while Washington focused on tariffs and trade wars, Beijing was securing access to rare earth metals, the essential materials needed for solar panels, batteries, and electric Vehicles. The message was clear. America was still fighting the battles of yesterday, oil, gas, and trade wars. China, they were winning the war for tomorrow. But the most dangerous part of all this? It wasn't just about energy. It was about global influence. Because once China established this new system, something terrifying started to happen. Other countries began abandoning the US energy market. Middle Eastern nations started shifting their sails away from America. European allies began hedging their bets, signing deals with China. Even longtime US partners started looking for alternatives. And the worst part? This wasn't a temporary shift. This was permanent. The world was moving away from US energy, and America, they had no way to stop it. Because even as Washington imposed sanctions, even as they froze assets, even as they threatened retaliation, it wasn't working. Why? Because China had already prepared for every single move. And when Washington finally realized the full scale of Beijing's plan, it was too late. The new energy order was already in place. The petrodollar system was weakening. The US was no longer the dominant force in global energy. And China, they weren't just another player in the game anymore. They were running the game itself. And the most terrifying part? They weren't finished yet. Because even as the US scrambled for a response, China made one final move. A move so bold, so disruptive, it left Washington completely cornered. And if you think what's happened so far is bad, what happens next is even worse. The moment the US realized the full scale of China's plan, Washington went into full-blown crisis mode. Intelligence reports poured in, and the numbers weren't just bad. They were catastrophic. The petrodollar was losing its grip. US energy exports were collapsing at record speed. China's new trade system was expanding faster than anyone thought possible. And the worst part, every countermeasure was failing. Sanctions had no effect. China had already built workarounds. Freezing assets was pointless. China's energy trade was now operating outside the dollar. Tariffs were backfiring. The biggest losers were American oil companies. For the first time in decades, Washington was out of options. This wasn't just an economic crisis. This was an energy war. And as the White House scrambled for a solution, another disaster was unfolding. For years, the United States had been the dominant force in global oil and gas. American crude flowed to Europe, Asia, and beyond. Liquefied natural gas powered industries from Germany to Japan. But overnight, that dominance started crumbling. China's new system wasn't just a threat, it was an alternative. And other countries? They were already choosing sides. Saudi Arabia announced new long-term deals with China. The UAE shifted energy investments toward Beijing. Even longtime US partners started quietly reducing their dependence on American oil. And then came the next blow. News of China's growing energy control sent Wall Street into a full-scale panic. Investors scrambled to dump US energy stocks. Oil companies lost billions in market value overnight. Analysts warned that the crisis was spiraling out of control. Inside Washington, panic was setting in. This wasn't just a market crash. This was a complete restructuring of global energy, power. And it was happening faster than anyone had imagined. The Federal Reserve tried to calm the markets. The Treasury Department rushed to reassure investors. But behind closed doors, the message was clear. This crisis wasn't going away. And now the US had one final option left. With no other choice, Washington launched its most aggressive counterattack. Yet first, they tried to force China back into the dollar system. US officials pressured the IMF, the World Bank, and global financial leaders to reject China's trade system. The goal was clear: cripple China's energy trade before it could grow. But China had already prepared for this. Beijing responded by doubling down on its digital currency trade. Within weeks, major oil producers started signing deals in yuan, abandoning the dollar completely. Then the US tried to block China's oil deals. The White House imposed harsh new sanctions on China's key energy partners, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. The plan was to cut off China's supply before the system could expand further. But again, China was 2 steps ahead. Secret deals had already been made. Oil shipments were being rerouted through hidden trading networks. Sanctions could freeze bank accounts, but they couldn't stop the flow of crude. And then the US made its most dangerous move yet. Inside the Pentagon, military officials were drafting emergency strategies. Because for decades, American energy dominance wasn't just about production, it was about military control. The US Navy patrolled key shipping lanes. US forces protected energy-rich regions, and intelligence agencies tracked every major oil deal. But now, that wasn't enough. China's energy system was designed to work without US oversight. And that meant something terrifying. For the first time in modern history, the United States had no control over a rising global power. This wasn't just an economic war. This was a geopolitical earthquake, and Washington knew it. That's when officials started discussing a strategy that had been used before, a strategy that could stop China's rise, but at a devastating cost. Because if America couldn't win this war economically, it could escalate militarily, and that was a red line no one wanted to cross. The White House faced a stark choice: accept the new reality or risk an all-out confrontation. China had played its hand. It had dismantled US energy dominance piece by piece. It had built an unstoppable trade system. And it had done it without firing a single shot. The US had one last move left. A move that could either stabilize the situation or push the world to the brink. And as Washington prepared its final decision, one question remained. Was it already too late? Everything had been leading to this moment. The warnings, the sanctions, the desperate attempts to reclaim control. But nothing had worked. And then China made its final move. A move so bold, so devastating, that it left Washington with no way out. Because if the United States thought it could pressure China back into submission, Beijing had just proven otherwise. This wasn't just about energy anymore. This was about replacing the United States as the world's economic superpower. And in one shocking moment, China took its final step toward that goal. It happened quietly, without any grand announcement, without any warning. But the effects, they were instant. The world woke up to a financial earthquake. China had just pulled the trigger on one final game-changing deal. A move so extreme, it would reshape the global economy forever. For the first time in modern history, China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia had formed a unified energy alliance, one that would officially end the petrodollar system. The agreement was simple. From this moment on, every barrel of oil traded between these nations would no longer be priced in US dollars. Instead, it would be denominated in Chinese yuan. And just like that, a financial pillar that had kept the US dominant for decades was suddenly gone. But it wasn't just Saudi Arabia. In the hours that followed, more countries rushed to join the new trade system. The UAE, Iran, Brazil, even European nations began considering alternatives. Washington was in shock, because without the petrodollar, the US economy was now exposed in a way it had never been before. For years, America's dominance had been built on one truth. As long as the world needed US dollars to buy oil, the US economy would always remain powerful. But now, that system was breaking down. And the consequences were immediate. Markets plunged. The value of the dollar collapsed. Foreign investors began dumping US assets at a terrifying pace. And inside Washington, panic turned to outright chaos. This was worse than any recession. Worse than any crisis America had faced in decades. Because this wasn't just an economic shift. This was the beginning of a global financial realignment, one where America was no longer the center of power. The Treasury Department called for emergency measures. The Federal Reserve held late-night meetings, searching for ways to stabilize the situation. But the truth, there was no easy fix. China had rewritten the rules of global trade, and the US was now playing by Beijing's terms. And then the final blow landed. Because while Washington scrambled for answers, China made one last, chilling announcement. Beijing declared that it would begin selling off portions of its massive US debt holdings. The message was clear. If America wanted to fight China economically, China was prepared to collapse the US financial system completely. In a single moment, Washington faced a choice it had never expected to make: continue fighting and risk a full-blown financial catastrophe that could take down the entire US economy, or back down and accept a new world order where China controlled global energy trade. The silence in Washington was deafening. For decades, America had been the world's undisputed superpower. But now, that era was coming to an end. And the most terrifying part? It all happened without a single shot being fired. China had won the war, not with military force, but with strategy, patience, and economic warfare. The US had no choice but to adapt to this new reality. Because the truth was undeniable. The balance of power had shifted, and the world would never be the same again. The world has changed. The energy war is over, but not in the way anyone expected. For decades, the United States dominated global oil trade. The petrodollar system made sure of that. Every major oil deal went through US financial institutions. Every country that wanted energy had to play by Washington's rules. But now, that era is over. China has built an alternative system, one that no longer depends on the US dollar, one that has already restructured global trade. Washington tried to stop it. It failed. Sanctions, ineffective trade restrictions, backfired military. Pressure, too risky. Every countermeasure the US tried was met with an even stronger response from China. And now America is left facing a stark reality. The global balance of power has shifted. And for the first time in modern history, the US is not in control. The question is, what happens next? Because this isn't just about energy anymore. This is about the future of global influence. The petrodollar system held up the entire US economy. It allowed Washington to print unlimited money, control trade, and sanction any nation that stepped out of line. But if more countries abandon the US dollar, if China's system continues to grow, if the world's biggest economies start shifting their alliances, then what happens to America's power? More importantly, what happens to the average American? Because make no mistake, the effects of this are already being felt. Oil prices are volatile. Inflation is spiraling. Global markets are losing confidence in the US financial system. And this is only the beginning, which leads to the real question, the one no one in Washington wants to answer. Is this the start of a new world order? One where China, not the US, dictates the future of energy, trade, and global influence? And if so, what should America do next? Some will argue that the US should adapt, find a way to work within this new system. Cut new deals, avoid direct confrontation. Others believe the US should fight back harder than ever, impose even tougher sanctions, use military force to protect its economic interests, do whatever it takes to reclaim dominance. But the truth, there's no easy way out, because China has spent decades preparing for this. And now, it's in control. So here's the question for you. Do you think this is the end of US energy dominance? Or is there still a way for America to turn this around? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this conversation is far from over.